Greetings, sisters and brothers. Welcome to Hearts of Darkness, my podcast. I'm your host, Milton Allimadi. What is Hearts of Darkness? Hearts of Darkness is a podcast which explores why Africa historically has been viewed as the antithesis of civilization. So the podcast is going to start by readings and a discussion from my book of the same title, Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. I'm going to be publishing the third edition of this book in April 2020. The first edition was published in 2003, the second edition in 2016. So today I'll discuss the purpose of the book and I'll read from a chapter from the book. And over the next several weeks, you will be hearing me reading and discussing each chapter from the book. The book's summary is this thesis: that historically, Africa was demonized in Western media in order to justify, in the first place, the enslavement of Africans. So in other words, the West had to create a narrative which would justify the enslavement of other human beings. So obviously they had to be depicted as less than human beings, as subhumans. And that justified the first narrative. The second narrative was to justify the conquest and colonization of Africa in the 19th century by the European powers, led by countries such as Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Germany. These were the primary countries that conquered and colonized the continent of Africa. They had a conference in Berlin, 1884-85, the Berlin Conference. The third narrative occurred in the post-colonial period. The demonization of Africa and Africans, and by extension, Africa diaspora all over the world, was to exonerate the crimes that had been committed during the enslavement regime and during the conquest and colonization. So in other words, the narrative continued saying, Africans do not deserve independence. And that justifies the continuation of Western interference in the internal affairs of African countries. In the 1960s, the focus was on what had been the Belgian Congo, now called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And as recently as 2011, it was to justify the Western intervention in Libya. So over the next several weeks, when you hear readings from my book, you'll get a better understanding and you'll realize that the demonization of Africa was by no accident. It was by calculated design. And the continued demonization of Africa in the 21st century is also a calculated design. So let me now read from the first chapter of my book. And then I'll pause also for a moment just to discuss the implications of what I've read. The first chapter is entitled Inquiry into the Origin of Black Skin. And what is the meaning of that? That is to show that historically, as far as when Herodotus was writing, the West portrayed blackness of skin as something that was an aberration, because white skin color was considered to be the normal. So all these so-called learned individuals through the centuries wrote and tried to explain why black skin was an aberration and how it appeared in the first place. So let me now read from the book itself, chapter 1. Historically, Western media manufactured and disseminated the predominant image of Africans as savages in order to justify the exploitation of Africans and the plunder of the continent's resources. The objective was to justify the terrible crimes committed against Africans during various stages of history, including the period of enslavement of Africans, the period of European conquest and partition of Africa, the period of colonial regime in Africa, and the neo-colonial period, which includes the contemporary era. The racist representations of Africa were popularized in the Western world through the published journals of the early European travelers, the so-called explorers, who went to Africa to, quote, discover, end quote, landmarks such as lakes, rivers, and mountains, and then to rename those landmarks after the leading European monarchs of their era. These travelers mapped the continent and paved the way for formal European conquest of Africa and colonization. Some, like Samuel Baker, later became colonial governors. In modern times, the depictions of Africans as, quote, backward, end quote, and, quote, primitive, end quote, were disseminated through newspapers, magazines, books, and Hollywood films, including the Stallion series. The demonization of Africans was so pervasive and effective that they became regarded as, quote, savages, end quote, universally in the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia. The negative representations promoted racist white supremacy while diminishing the self-esteem of many Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. The demonization of Africans in Western writing was so effective that today, the Europeans who committed barbaric actions, massacres, rapes, pillage, theft, and enslavement of Africans are regarded as the bearers of civilization and enlightenment, while their African victims are regarded as the ones who were, quote, backward, end quote. What's more, many contemporary writers, including Africans themselves, still view and write about Black people through the prism of bigotry created over the centuries. Some of the most enduring deep-seated stereotypes about Africans, African descendants, and the continent are that the Black inhabitants of the African continent are, quote, barbaric, end quote, and, quote, primitive, end quote. Black people are morally, spiritually, and intellectually inferior relative to.
Hi, I'm Shawnee, and whenever I want to listen to something profound and I'm having a moment, I go to GoPro Radio, the fastest growing network in the galaxy.
Africans have made no contributions to world history, culture, social, artistic, and scientific developments. Africans are, quote, uncivilized, end quote. The African continent itself is so disease-ridden that it's physically inhospitable. Europeans claimed they took control of the continent to spread Christianity and to civilize the, quote, natives, end quote. At each stage of the establishment of the exploitative relationship between Europe and Africa, white supremacy, disguised as the, quote, white man's burden, end quote, or mandate to improve the lot of the natives, was invoked. So, during the era of enslavement of Africans, people taken into captivity to the Americas were represented as subhumans in order to rationalize and justify the terrorism they were subjected to. Capture, the Middle Passage, being auctioned off as property, and being worked to death on plantations, while enduring fiendish tortures. During the period of colonial conquest in the 19th century, Africans were also depicted as inferior human beings, in need of Christianity and the civilizing influence of European governance. Then in the era after independence, Africans were presented as people incapable of governing themselves, thus justifying and exonerating the Europeans who had enslaved and colonized them. The demonization also rationalized post-colonial and contemporary Western military interference in Africa's affairs, as in the Congo in the 1960s and Libya in 2011. How and when did the negative representations of Africans begin? From the earliest period, Europeans were intrigued by the black skin color of Africans. Some of the best minds published, quote, learned, end quote, papers through the centuries, offering explanations about the origin, the causes, and the meaning of blackness of skin. Herodotus, 484 to 425 BC, who was hailed as the father of modern history, opined that, quote, the seed of the Ethiopians is also black, and this sperm, which enters into the woman, is not white like that of other men, but black like their skin, end quote. So here I pause from the book for a second. Herodotus was saying Africans had black skin color because their semen, their sperm, was also black. And that is how it resulted in the black pigmentation of Africans. That was one of the more profound explanations. So now let me continue from the book. Herodotus also taught his contemporaries and many generations thereafter about the continent's peculiar and exotic inhabitants, claiming, quote, for this is the tract in which the huge serpents are found, and the lions, and the elephants, the bears, the aspics, and the horned asses. Here too are the dog-faced creatures, and the creatures without heads, which the Libyans declare to have their eyes in their breast, and also the wild men and wild women, and many other less fabulous beasts, end quote. Given Herodotus' revered status as a scholar, few of his contemporaries could have challenged or refuted his enlightened assessment of Africans and the continent. So, the Western mind was conditioned to accept a fantastic and grotesque image of Africans and Africa from a very early stage. With white skin color being regarded as normative, black skin color was viewed as an aberration that deserved scientific inquiry. Negative attributes were conferred upon black people. They were considered to be intellectually and spiritually inferior to white people. Those with darker skin tone and more pronounced, quote, African features, end quote, were perceived to be even less intelligent. White physicians, scholars, religious leaders, and politicians offered their explanation for the origins and the meaning of blackness of skin. In Pseudodoxica Epidemica, 1646, Sir Thomas Browne, renowned for his writings on medicine, science, and religion, attributed blackness of skin to, quote, black jaundice, end quote, or, quote, mutations, end quote, or, quote, inward use of certain waters, end quote, or, quote, the power and efficacy of imagination, end quote. In other words, black people were originally white people who kept fantasizing about being black until their wishes were granted. In the 18th century, Thomas Jefferson, a founding father of the American Republic, offered his opinion on the origins of black skin in Notes on the State of Virginia, 1781. At the same time, Jefferson was smart enough to know that he could not prove a claim that whites were inherently more intelligent than blacks, so he hedged a little. Quote, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind, end quote. Jefferson wrote, quote, whether the black of the Negro resides in the reticular membrane between the skin and scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from that of some other secretion, the difference is fixed in nature, and it is real as if its seat and cause were better known to us, end quote. Jefferson continued. Jefferson wanted to explain the difference between blacks and whites in order to justify why he advocated that freed blacks were better off being resettled, quote, beyond the realm of mixture with whites, end quote. Jefferson did not want black people to cohabitate or miscegenate with whites. Quote, besides those of color of figure and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race, end quote. Jefferson continued, quote, they have less hair on the face and body. They secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin, which give them a very strong and disagreeable odor, end quote. Jefferson might have added that the profuse sweating was produced by the daily toil these Africans he was familiar with because they were forced to work on his plantation. They were enslaved. Here again I pause.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you a great opportunity. If you have an event, product, business, talent, and/or something important to say, now is your chance. You can have your very own radio show. Whether you're just starting out or a veteran looking for a professional platform to enhance your presentation and following, the GoPro Radio Network is the premier place to cultivate and share new and exciting content. We can help you grow your audience and keep it growing long after your first broadcast. Now you have a voice. Call 646-415-0990 or go to www.goproradio.com. That's www.goproradio.com. You'll be amazed at how easy and affordable it is to have your own professional radio show on the fastest growing network in the galaxy. GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
In this third edition, I'm reading from the second edition of the book. In the third edition, I expand a little more on Jefferson's allegations about Africans. And obviously, he was trying to justify and demonize them to rationalize the fact that he himself at one time owned 150 enslaved Africans. And through his lifetime, he owned more than 250 enslaved Africans. So his rationalization, of course, cannot be surprising. I'm now going to move toward the latter part of this first chapter and read from that for about a minute now. The tendency to venerate Africans with less, quote, Negroid, end quote, features was found even in the writings of Europeans who condemned their enslavement. In her novel, Orunuku, the Royal Slave, 1688, Afra Ben, the 17th century abolitionist, who was reputedly the first English woman to earn a living, through her writing, tried to humanize Africans by assigning them what she considered to be ideal physical attributes. Quote, his face was not that brown rusty black, which most of that nation are, but a perfect ebony or polished black, end quote. Ben wrote, describing Orunuku, the hero of her novel, who was to later lead a slave revolt. Quote, his nose was rising and Roman, instead of African and flat. His mouth, the finest shape that could be seen, far from the great turned lips, which are so natural to the rest of the Negroes, end quote. So here I conclude the chapter by reading from Afra Ben's book. And she was a supporter of Africans and was an abolitionist. But even she had been conditioned to believe that beauty had to take on Europeanized attributes instead of African attributes. I now close the first chapter of The Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. And I hope you will tune in to the next section of my podcast, The Hearts of Darkness. Thank you, sisters and brothers.